The last weekend of October always carried a kind of magic in Maplewood, a small town tucked between ridges of red oaks and maple groves. But this year the air felt sharper, colder, like the season itself was holding its breath. The annual autumn, fair-filled Main Street with color and noise, the kind of gathering where neighbors greeted one another, children ran free, and traders called out their prices over the hum of laughter. It was a celebration before the long freeze of winter, a tradition that made the little town feel larger than it was. The air smelled of roasted peanuts and spiced cider, drifting on plumes of chimney smoke. Booths lined the streets, long rows of folding tables sagging beneath rusted tools, cracked teacups, yellowed books, faded dresses, and every odd thing pulled from basements and barns. Lanterns swayed above the stalls, their glass rattling in. The wind, while leaves spun across the cobblestones, crunching under the boots of passers-by. A farmer shouted prices for bruised apples. A woman jingled bracelets promising they were real silver, only $1, and children shrieked as they darted through the crowd with sticky red candy apples clutched in their small hands. To most, it was the happiest day of the season. But in the shadows of this noisy fair, where the cheer seemed to skip past unnoticed, two small girls moved differently. 8-year-old twins, nearly identical in their honey-blonde hair and dirt-smudged. Cheeks lingered at the edges of the stalls. Their names were Laya and Wren. Laya carried Wren on her back, her sister's thin arms looped loosely around her shoulders. To anyone else, they may have looked like ordinary children lost in the bustle. But to those who looked closer, there was a fragility about them, like porcelain too often handled and cracked. A year before, their mother had passed away, leaving them alone. The man who briefly called himself their stepfather had vanished without a word soon after, leaving the twins to survive on scraps and corners of shelter, under bridges, in barns, most recently in an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. Hunger was a constant, and cold had become a second skin. But worse still, just 1 week earlier, Wren had fallen down a stairwell in that warehouse, fracturing her leg. They had no doctor, no medicine, only Laya's desperate attempt to bind the injury with a strip of torn cloth. Since then, Laya had carried her everywhere. Each step was heavy, but she never complained. The only thing heavier was the fear of failing her sister. And now, on this day, they had come with purpose. In Laya's pocket were 4 wrinkled $1 bills, smoothed flat, as if neatness could make them worth more. It was everything they had. Their goal was simple, though desperate, to find something that might help Wren walk again. The fair was dazzling, a sea of distractions. Wren's eyes lingered on the food stalls, the golden glow of caramel corn, the steaming cider cups. But Laya pressed forward. She stopped when she spotted a table piled with medical odds and ends, splints, faded pill bottles, even a dusty wheelchair missing a wheel. Behind it sat an old man in a green wool cap, a tobacco-stained mustache curling above his lip. Among the clutter lay a single aluminum crutch. The rubber padding was cracked, the metal scratched, but it was sturdy. "How much?" Laya asked, trying to keep her voice steady though her chest thudded hard. The man studied her, squinting at the sight of a child bargaining. His voice came, out rough. $4? Exactly what they had? Wren stirred on her back, hope flashing across her face. "Laya, that's perfect," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "I could try walking with that. Please." For the first time in a long while, Laya allowed herself to imagine it. Wren leaning on that crutch, no longer a burden carried on her back, maybe even smiling again. Relief knotted her throat. She pressed her hand against the bills in her pocket, ready to pull them free. But before she could, her gaze shifted. Just beyond the stall, almost hidden behind a stack of dented oil cans, a fraying rope tied to a fence post caught her eye. At the end of it, lay a German shepherd. He was old, perhaps, 8 years or more. His ribs showed faintly beneath his coat, patches of fur were missing, and one hind leg hung awkwardly, never touching the ground. His left ear was torn, scarred pink against black fur. And yet, when his amber eyes lifted to meet theirs, everything else fell away. There was no whimper, no begging. Only a steady, quiet gaze, deep and unblinking, as though he had been waiting for them all along. Wren's breath caught. "Laya," she whispered, reverent, almost afraid to break the moment. The man at the stall beside the dog noticed them watching. His name scrawled on a cardboard sign read, "Carl Bowers, Odds and Ends." He was thick around the waist, beard patchy, plaid jacket stained with grease. His hands stayed buried in his pockets as if holding his temper down. "You looking?" He asked, voice low and rough as gravel. "What's his story?" Laya asked. Carl snorted. "No story. Old dog, bad leg, eats too much. $6 or he goes to the shelter Monday." The word shelter struck like ice. In Maplewood, everyone knew what that meant for animals too old or broken. Short stays, quick endings. Wren slid carefully off her sister's back, leaning on the edge of the table to balance. Her wide eyes never left the shepherd. The fair roared around them, children laughing, merchants calling, boots crunching leaves. But to the girls, the world had narrowed to two things: a crutch and a dog. Wren tugged at Laya's sleeve, her voice small, heavy with guilt. "The crutch. Laya, it could help me." "I know," Laya whispered, throat tight. But her eyes returned to the shepherd. Despite his pain, he pushed himself upright, sitting tall, his gaze steady on them. He didn't cry out, didn't shift. He only looked at them with a certainty that shook her. It was as if his eyes said, "I am yours if you'll take me." Logic screamed for the crutch. It was survival, plain and clear. But the shepherd, he meant something else, something that couldn't be named. The bills trembled in Laya's hand as she stepped toward Carl's stall. Up close, the man's eyes were rimmed red, his plaid sleeves dark with stains. His words came out harsh. $6. Don't waste my time, kid." Laya straightened, her voice shaking but determined. "We only have 4. Please, it's all we've got." Carl barked out a laugh. "4? For a dog like him, you'd be better off with that crutch." He jerked a thumb toward the medical stall. Wren's chin lifted, though her leg throbbed beneath her. Her voice was soft but clear. "We'll take care of him, we promise. No one else will love him like we do." Carl studied them for a moment. Thin children, faces dusty, clothes worn, but in their eyes was something raw, stubborn, unyielding hope. He muttered under his breath, rubbed his beard, then finally sighed. "Fine. 4. But don't come back crying when he eats you out of scraps." He thrust out his hand. Before he could change his mind, Laya pressed the wrinkled bills into his palm. He pocketed them quickly, turning away to hawk a fishing reel to another passerby as though the deal meant nothing. But for the twins, the decision meant everything. Laya crouched at the shepherd's side, loosening the rope from the fence post. "Hi, boy," she whispered. Her fingers brushed the coarse fur at his neck. The dog's ears twitched forward, and for the first time his head tilted as if acknowledging her. He rose slowly, limping but steady, and stepped forward with a quiet obedience. That startled her. Wren reached out, her small hand resting against the dog's shoulder. His buddy was lean beneath her touch, muscles worn, but still strong. He lowered his head slightly, brushing his nose against her wrist, and Wren let out a soft laugh. The sound brittle but true. "What should we call him?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Laya thought for a moment. The way he moved close, silent but constant, reminded her of something ever-present. "Shadow," she said at last, "because he'll always be by our side like a shadow." The dog blinked. amber rays catching the late autumn light. His tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. Not far from the stall, an older woman had been arranging trays of sweet buns and pumpkin pies under a striped canvas awning. Her name was Mrs. Hattie Miller, a widow in her 70s with a stooped back and hair pinned neatly beneath a knitted cap. Lines etched her face deeply, but her blue eyes still carried warmth. She had seen more than her share of the fair's exchanges, and few things surprised her any more. Yet the sight of two ragged children giving up everything for a scarred old dog made her pause. Leaning on her cane, she watched as the shepherd leaned protectively against the girls. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Well, now," she murmured to herself, "that's a bargain no money could measure." A few customers at her stall overheard, turning to watch. Some shook their heads with disbelief. "Foolish," muttered a man in a heavy coat carrying a sack of apples. "Trading food money for a dying mutt." Another woman, plump and sharp-tongued, clucked her tongue. "Children these days don't know sense. That crutch would have done more good." But not all voices were critical. A younger woman balancing a toddler on her hip whispered softly, "They chose with their hearts. Maybe that's something the rest of us forgot how to do." The whispers spread like threads through the fair, some mocking, some thoughtful. For the first time in a long while, Laya and Wren were not invisible. Shadow walked between them as they moved away from the stall, his pace careful, almost measured. When Wren stumbled on her good leg, he shifted subtly closer, letting her lean against his shoulder. It was instinctive, unspoken, as though he had already taken her under his protection. Laya glanced at her sister, then at the dog, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something fragile but powerful. Safety behind them. Mrs. Miller continued to sell her pastries, her smile lingering as she watched the little trio disappear into the crowd. She knew stories like theirs had a way of circling back, of changing more than just the lives of those directly involved. Maplewood was a town slow to notice suffering, but sometimes it only took one quiet act of love to stir the air. The fair carried on, the laughter and bargaining undisturbed. But for two sisters and an old shepherd, a choice had been made, one that would shape everything to come. The fair had faded into memory by the time the sun dipped behind the hills of Maplewood. The laughter and clamor of Main Street gave way to quiet alleys where shadows stretched long, and the air carried the smell of damp wood. Leia guided her sister, ran carefully along the edge of town, Shadow padding silently beside them. His limp slowed him, but his presence filled the air with a new sense of steadiness, as if the cold night could no longer touch them in the same way. At the far edge of the sawmill district stood a warehouse long abandoned, its paint peeled to gray, windows boarded and cracked. Behind it lay an old lumber storage shed, its roof sagging under the weight of years, but still standing against the winds. This was where the girls had been sleeping before, and now they led Shadow inside. The scent of dust and dry timber greeted them. Stacks of warped planks leaned against the walls, and gaps in the boards let in thin stripes of moonlight. Laya spread a torn blanket on the floor where Wren could sit, lowering her carefully so she wouldn't jar the injured leg. Wren winced but offered her sister a smile, her eyes bright even through the pain. "It feels better with him here," she whispered, glancing at Shadow, who circled once before settling near the doorway. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his gaze remained fixed on the entrance, as though keeping watch. For the first time since the accident, Laya let herself exhale. She stroked Wren's hair, then leaned against the rough wall, her own eyes growing heavy. Outside, the wind rustled through the weeds, but inside the steady sound of Shadow's breathing lulled them into a fragile sleep. Morning came with a weak sun, spilling pale light through the cracks. Laya stirred first. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a reminder that their pockets were empty after the fair. She touched her sister's shoulder gently. Wren opened her eyes and whispered, "Don't worry about me. I can wait." But Laya knew waiting wasn't enough. She pulled her sweater tighter and stood. "I'll find something. Stay with Shadow." Wren nodded, reaching. Toe scratch behind the shepherd's ear. He leaned into her touch, amber eyes soft, though his ears still flicked toward every sound. Laya walked back toward town, the chill biting her cheeks. She passed town's folk who barely looked at her. Men hauling firewood, women clutching baskets, children skipping past with scarves wrapped high. No one stopped. She had grown used to it. In Maplewood, pity rarely turned to action. At last, she reached the bakery on Elm Street. The bell above the door chimed as she pushed it open, and a wave of warmth and the smell of fresh bread enveloped her. Behind the counter stood Martha Ellison, the bakery's owner. Martha was a woman in her late 40s, taloned, broad-shouldered, with auburn hair tied in a bun stret with silver. Her cheeks were always flushed from the oven's heat, and her hands bore a dusting of flour, no matter the hour. Her expression could seem stern, but beneath it lay a quiet kindness. She had lived in Maplewood all her life, raising 2 boys who now worked far away, and her bakery had become the heart of the town's mornings. Laya hesitated at the counter, her hands twisting in her sweater hem. "Do you have anything old? Maybe bread from yesterday?" Martha's sharp eyes studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small brown paper bag. She placed it on the counter, tapping the top with a flour-dusted finger. "Take this," she said briskly, as though it were nothing at all. Inside, Laya found 2 rolls, still soft and warm, with a corner of apple tart tucked between. She stared, her lips parting, but before she could thank her, Martha turned away to tend to another customer. It was her way, never too soft, never drawing attention. Clutching the bag to her chest, Laya hurried back to the shed. Wren's face lit up when she saw the food, and they tore the rolls in half, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Shadow lay nearby watching, and when Laya offered him a crumb, he took it gently from her hand, chewing with slow dignity. The days passed in rhythm, morning walks to the bakery, afternoons huddled in the shed, evenings listening to the wind. Wren's leg ached, but she never complained. She played small games with Shadow, tapping rhythms on the floor for him to follow with paw taps or whispering secrets into his ear as if he could carry them for her. Leela bore the weight of worry and silence, her back aching from carrying her sister. But she felt less alone with the dog guarding them. Shadow rarely left the doorway, his ears swiveling to every noise, his body taut like a coiled spring. One evening, as darkness deepened and the cold sharpened, footsteps crunched outside. At first, Laya thought it was only the wind-shifting gravel. Then came the sound of a bottle clattering, followed by a low, tuneless humming. Aman's shadow swayed against the broken boards. The door rattled and a figure stumbled into view. A man, with sagging shoulders, a torn coat, and eyes glassy with drink. His beard was unkempt, his boots muddy, and the stench of liquor clung to him like smoke. He muttered something under his breath and stepped closer to the shed, peering through a gap in the boards. Laya froze, pulling Wren close. The man took another step, his hand fumbling at the door. Before Laya could move, Shadow was already there. He rose, hackles lifting, teeth bared in a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floor. The sound stopped the man cold. His eyes widened, and for a moment he swayed in place, caught between his drunken haze and the primal warning before him. When Shadow stepped forward, muscles taut, the growl deepening, the man cursed under his breath, "Crazy mutt." He staggered back, nearly tripping over his own feet, then turned and stumbled into the night, his humming fading into nothing. Inside, the shed, silence held for a long moment. Laya's heart pounded in her ears. She looked at Shadow, still rigid at the door, his eyes blazing slowly. As the danger faded, he relaxed, returning to his post with a steady dignity. Wren let out the breath she had been holding. "He saved us," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Laya reached to touch Shadow's fur, her hands sinking into the coarse hair at his neck. For the first time, she realized he was more than just a companion. He was a guardian, a soldier who had chosen Theme as his charge. That night, the three of them huddled close against the cold. Shadow stretched out beside the girls. The shed creaked and groaned with the winter winds, but within its walls they felt safer than they ever had before. The shed had become their refuge, though it was never truly warm. Nights creaked with the wind. Mornings carried frost through the cracks in the boards. Laya and Wren curled close together on their thin blanket. Shadow pressed near the doorway, his head lifting at every noise. He was a shield against the world, yet even his steady gaze could not soften the hunger gnawing at their bellies or the cold that seeped into their bones. It was during one such morning, when the first pale light broke across Maplewood's rooftops, that the sound of footsteps approached. Not hurried or stumbling like the drunkards before, but steady, deliberate, accompanied by the faint creak of wicker. Shadow stiffened instantly, ears sharp, body leaning forward with quiet tension. Through a gap in the shed's wall, Laya glimpsed a figure. A tall woman draped in a long wool coat, its hem brushing the ground. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. Though Wise had escaped to frame her lined face, she carried herself with a kind of practiced dignity, as if the years had taught her to endure without breaking. Across her arm swung a basket lined with cloth. This was Evelyn Harper, a widow in her mid-50s who lived 2 houses down from the abandoned lumberyard. She had the look of someone accustomed to solitude, shoulders straight, eyes quietly observant, and hands that moved with careful purpose. For all her calm appearance, sorrow clung to her like an invisible veil. She had lost her husband in a trucking accident 15 years earlier, and later her only son to a long illness that had hollowed out her days. Since then, she had filled her hours with sewing, gardening, and quiet walks. But the silence in her home had grown heavy. When Evelyn drew nearer, Shadow gave a low growl. The sound reverberated through the small shed, a warning ass-harp as any lock. Laya tensed, pulling Wren close, but Evelyn did not flinch. She stopped a few feet away, setting the basket gently on the ground. "Easy now," she said softly, her voice carrying the measured warmth of someone who had spoken to frightened animals before. "I mean no harm." Shadow's growl softened. Though his body remained taut, his amber eyes locked on Evelyn's as if weighing her soul. Slowly, he lowered his head, not in submission, but in recognition. Laya's heart pounded. If Shadow trusted her enough to ease, perhaps they could too. Still, suspicion clung to her. Trust had never been given freely in their lives. Evelyn knelt, opening the basket. Inside were 2 loaves of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of soup, and a folded quilt with patches of faded blue. She placed them carefully in the dirt before rising again. "You look cold," she said, her eyes flicking to Wren's leg bound with strips of cloth and tired. Wren, though shy, whispered, "Is that for us?" Evelyn's lips curved into a small smile. "If you'll take it." Laya's instinct was to refuse, to keep walls up, to guard what little pride remained. But then Shadow stepped forward, nose twitching toward the quilt, tail giving a slow, deliberate wag. His acceptance was silent, but undeniable. Lay swallowed hard, then nodded. "Thank you," she murmured. Evelyn left the basket and turned as though to leave, not pressing them, not demanding gratitude. That, more than anything, unsettled Laya. People who truly wanted nothing in return were rare. Over the days that followed, Evelyn returned quietly. Sometimes, In the morning, sometimes at dusk, always with something small. A jar of preserves, a bundle of firewood, an old scarf. She never lingered long, never asked too many questions. She spoke gently, offering stories of her garden, of how the frost would soon claim her roses, of the stray cats she once fed behind her house. At first, Laya kept her replies short, wary offity, but Wren, with her open heart, asked questions, listened, smiled. Shadow always stood between them, watchful yet calm, as if acting as judge. And each time, the dog's steady gaze seemed to reassure Laya. This woman was not a threat. One evening, Evelyn brought an extra quilt, its fabric worn but warm. She spread it over the girls as they huddled together. Her hands lingered just a moment, too long, eyes clouding with something unspoken. That night, after she had gone, Laya caught the way Evelyn had looked at them. Not just with pity, but with something deeper, a longing almost maternal. In truth, Evelyn's visits were as much for her as for them. Alone in her quiet house, she often sat by the window, staring at the empty chair across from hers, the one her husband had once filled. On the mantel still rested a framed photograph of her son, his boyish grin frozen forever in time. Loss had hollowed her, leaving silence to echo in every corner. When she first saw the twins slipping into the lumber shed days earlier, she had hesitated. Approaching strangers was not in her nature anymore, but their thin figures, the way the elder carried the younger had tugged at something raw inside her. She had seen resilience in their eyes, the same fire her son once carried, and she could not turn away. Each time she left them with food or warmth, she lingered a moment too long at the shed's edge, her gaze resting on their small shapes. And each time she walked home with a heaviness in her chest, remembering the family she had lost. Helping them did not erase her grief, but it filled a corner of the emptiness. One night, as the wind howled through Maplewood, Evelyn arrived with Allantern. In hand, the shed rattled in the storm, its boards straining against the gusts. She stepped inside for the first time, her presence filling the small space with light and the faint smell of lavender soap. Shadow rose immediately, but this time he did not growl. He brushed past her hand, accepting her with quiet dignity. Laya, seeing the dog's trust, felt her own defenses slip. She allowed Evelyn to set down the lantern and spread another quilt over them. The warmth of the fabric and the warmth of Evelyn's quiet presence made something in her chest ache. Rest. Easy tonight, Evelyn said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Wren's forehead. Here ye's glistened in the lantern light, though she blinked quickly to hide it. As the storm raged outside, the three of them and the dog huddled together within the fragile safety of the shed. And for the first time, Laya felt that perhaps they were not entirely alone in the world. Late winter sunlight fell thinly over Maplewood, cold and brittle as glass. The air carried the metallic tang of snow yet to melt, and the streets of town felt quieter than usual, as though the whole place held its breath against the season's chill. Laya, Wren, and Shadow walked carefully along the narrow lane that led from the lumber shed toward town. Evelyn Harper had urged them to stretch their legs in daylight, promising to meet them later at the bakery with warm rolls. Shadow walked to their side, limping slightly but steady, his presence anchoring every step. They passed shuttered storefronts, the scent of smoke curling from chimneys above. Wren leaned against Shadow when her injured leg wavered, and the dog adjusted, seamlessly, guiding her as though it were second nature. Laya watched with a pride she could not put into words. Shadow wasn't just following them anymore. He was leading, protecting, almost reading their thoughts before they spoke. It was along that lane near the Old War Memorial Square that a figure noticed them. He stood a few yards away, shoulders hunched against the cold, hands tucked deep into the pockets of a worn field jacket, His hair, once dark, had thinned and gone gray at the temples. A faded scar traced across his cheek, half hidden by a few days' worth of stubble. His eyes, wine-sharp blue, though weary, followed the shepherd with sudden recognition. This was Tom Granger, a veteran in his late 40s who had served 2 tours overseas. Since returning, he had lived in a small cabin on the edge of Maplewood, mostly unseen. The war had left him with more than scars on his skin. It had hollowed something, inside making him wary of crowds, slow to speak, reluctant to seek company. He walked the town rarely, usually in the early mornings when few were out. Today, he had come down to buy nails from the hardware store, and instead had found himself rooted to the spot, staring at the dog. "Hold on," Tom muttered under his breath. Stepping closer, Laya instinctively tensed, pulling Wren behind her. Shadow stiffened, his ears flicking forward, his body angled between the girls and the stranger, his amber gaze fixed on Tom, not hostile, but measuring. Tom raised his hands slowly, palms open. "Easy there." "I don't mean any harm," his voice carried, the growly tone of someone who had spent years barking orders, now softened by time. But then, without thinking, he lifted his right hand in a sharp downward motion, an old military signal. Shadow reacted instantly. The shepherd dropped to the ground in perfect form, chin flat, legs tucked. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only flawless obedience. Laya gasped, eyes wide. Wren clutched her sister's sleeve. "La." He knew what to do. Tom's brows furrowed deeply. He crouched low, his eyes never leaving the dog. Then he made another sign, curling 2 fingers in a loop. Shadow rose, circled once, then returned to sit squarely at his right side, posture proud despite the limp. Tom exhaled sharply as though the breath had been knocked out of him. "I'll be damned. That's not just any dog." Evelyn Harper, who had been crossing the square with her basket of groceries, stopped in her tracks, watching the exchange unfold. Her tall frame, wrapped in her heavy coat, seemed suddenly fragile as she looked between the veteran and the children. Tom turned his gaze to the twins, voice low but steady. "Where did you get him?" Laya's voice trembled. "At the fair, he was tied." "Up! We bought him!" Tom shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and sorrow. "Do you know what you have here? That shepherd? He's trained military K9. I've seen dogs like him before, worked with them. Judging by the way he follows, signals he's seen service. And from the look of those scars, he's seen hell." The words seemed to hang in the cold air. Wren's lips parted. "He was a soldier." Tom nodded. "Yes, once. And a damn good one. If he still remembers all this," he reached out of hand, hesitated, then let it fall back to his knee. His eyes softened. "Looks like he's been left behind. Injured, maybe abandoned. But he didn't forget who he was." The girls stared at Shadow with a new kind of wonder. Pride welled in Wren's chest, her pain momentarily forgotten. Elala placed her hand on the shepherd's back, her voice hushed but fierce. "He's ours now, and we'll take care of him." Tom's gaze flicked to her, then to Evelyn, who had come closer, here eyes glistening. "Then you've got more than a pet," Tom said. "You've got a comrade, and he's chosen you." For Tom, the moment struck deeper than he expected. Watching the dog respond had pulled him back through time, back to deserts and convoys, nights punctured by explosions, the cries of men he couldn't save. He had seen dogs like Shadow drag wounded soldiers to safety, stand guard over camps when everyone else slept. His own closest friend in service had been a handler who didn't make it back. That bond had haunted him for years. Now seeing this battered shepherd standing watch over 2 frail children, Tom felt something shift in his chest. Memories once filled with bitterness softened, reshaped by the sight of resilience. The dog had survived, still carrying his training, still protecting. Perhaps there was something left for Tom, too. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice quiet, but certain. "It isn't coincidence, Tom. He was meant to find them." Tom's jaw tightened, but his eyes warmed. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging some invisible thread that bound them all together. The square bustled around them, townsfolk passing by, most paying little attention. To them, it was only a ragged pair of children, an old dog, and a scarred man standing in the cold. But to Evelyn, to Tom, to the girls, it was more. It was fate crossing paths, stitching broken lives together with the quiet strength of loyalty. Shadow lifted his head high, amber eyes steady, as if he understood every word. The storm came without mercy. Clouds the color of slate rolled in over Maplewood, swallowing the sun by late afternoon. By evening, snow whipped across the town in sheets so thick that even the street lamps glowed as vague, trembling halos. The wind howled down the alleys, rattling shutters and tearing at roofs. For most families, the night meant gathering by stoves with extra blankets. But for Laya, Wren, and Shadow, it was a battle against Thielmans in their fragile refuge. The old lumber shed creaked violently as gusts slammed against its sides. Their roof, already sagging from years of neglect, groaned under the weight of snow. Laya pressed Wren close beneath their patch quilts, her heart pounding with every new crack. Overhead, Shadow stood at the door, ears back, growling low as though the storm were something he could drive away. Then came the sound that made Laya's blood run cold. A deep crack followed by the splintering scream of wood. Snow and debris crashed inward, spilling across the floor. A beam split and crashed just feet from where Wren lay. The girl screamed, coughing as dust filled the air. Shadow lunged forward, barking sharply as if calling for help. And it came. Through the white outhaze, a lantern bobbed toward them. Evelyn Harper burst inside. Snow plastered to her coat, cheeks raw red from the wind. She had braved the storm. To check on them, fearing exactly this. Without hesitation, she pulled the girls into her arms. Shadow circled them, barking furiously as another section of the roof collapsed behind. "Quickly, come with 'em!" Evelyn shouted over the roar of the wind. Clutching Wren against her chest and guiding Laya with her free arm, she fought through the blizzard toward her own home 2 streets away. Shadow stayed close, plowing through the howl. Snow like a dark guardian, his limp hardly slowing him despite the biting cold. Evelyn's house stood firm against the storm. A modest 2-story cottage with shutters drawn tight and smoke rising from its chimney. Inside, warmth enveloped them. The glow of a fire, the scent of wood smoke and lavender. Evelyn quickly set Wren on a sofa, covering her with thick blankets. Laya collapsed into a chair, trembling, but safe. Shadow circled once before lying near. The hearth, his chest heaving, amber eyes still sharp. That night the storm raged on, but they were protected. The girls drifted into uneasy sleep, comforted by Evelyn's steady presence. Yet Shadow did not sleep. Sometime after midnight, a sharp scent reached his nose, faint but growing stronger. Gas. Shadow lifted his head, muscles tensing. He paced. To the window, ears flicking as he sniffed the air. Then, with sudden urgency, he let out a deep warning bark that echoed through the quiet house. Laya startled awake. "Shadow!" The shepherd barked again, louder, sharper, then bounded to the door. Pawing furiously, Evelyn rushed in, lantern in hand. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, but the smell reached her then too, a sour metallic tang carried in by the storm. Her eyes widened. "Thegus line," she whispered. "The Thompsons' place next door." The Thompsons were a retired couple who owned the small diner on the corner, their house adjoining the business. If gas was leaking in the storm, a single spark could destroy half the block. Evelyn threw on her boots and, together with Shadow, pulling at his lead, she hurried into the blizzard. Snow stung her face as they stumbled toward the diner's back porch. Shadow's barking grew frantic, guiding them. Evelyn pounded on the door until a blurry-eyed Mr. Thompson appeared, wrapped in a robe. "Gas leak!" Evelyn shouted. "Get out now!" The old man sniffed, his expression paling as realization hit. He hurried inside, rousing his wife, while Evelyn ran to the gas meter. Shadow stood guard, barking until lights flicked on in other houses, along the street. Neighbors emerged, braving the cold to help. Within minutes, the gas was shut off, and the Thompsons were led safely into the snow, trembling but alive. The explosion never came. Maplewood was spared. By dawn, the storm had quieted to a whisper. Snow lay deep and glittering, draped across rooftops like a shroud. In Evelyn's parlor, neighbors gathered with mugs of coffee, speaking in hushed, shaken tones. They all agreed on one thing. If not for Shadow's barking, the Thompsons' home, and perhaps theirs too, might have been reduced to ash. Shadow lay quietly by the fire, eyes half closed, tail thumping once when Lia's hand brushed over his fur. To the children, he was already their hero. But now to the town, he was something more. The story spread quickly. At the bakery, Martha Ellison relayed the tale to her morning customers, her flour-dusted hands gesturing for emphasis. "That dog saved us all," she said firmly, sliding loaves into paper bags. "I heard it from Evelyn herself. The Thompsons were minutes from disaster. Some customers who once muttered that the twins were foolish to buy an old dog now lowered their eyes. Others whispered that perhaps they had misjudged. One woman dabbed her eyes with her sleeve, murmuring, 'Imagine those children gave him a home, and he gave us ours in return.' Not everyone spoke aloud, but the undercurrent of change was there. The twins, once invisible, were being noticed, and Shadow, scarred and limping, was no longer just an old stray. He was Maplewood's silent guardian. The storm had passed, leaving Maplewood draped in a blanket of white that glittered under the pale morning sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and for once the air was filled not with silence, but with murmurs. Murmurs of a dog who had barked through the night and kept disaster from swallowing the town. Shadow's name was whispered in the bakery, murmured in the general store, passed from porch to porch with steaming mugs of coffee, and with his name came the story of the two ragged girls who had stood beside him. Lia and Wren, once invisible, were now part of every conversation. At Evelyn Harper's home, the girls sat curled together on the sofa, quilts wrapped snugly around them. Wren's cheeks glowed pink from the firelight, and even her injured leg seemed to trouble her less. Lia watched Shadow stretch near the hearth, his tail thumping whenever anyone said his name. For the first time in months, their shoulders weren't weighed down by fear alone. They carried something new. Hope. Evelyn, tall and composed, even in her simple wool dress, stood by the window, watching neighbors trudging through the snow. Her heart, once hollow, swelled with fierce determination. The town was talking, and she would not let their attention drift away. These girls deserved more than quilts and baskets of food. They deserved a life. When Tom Granger arrived that afternoon, stomping snow from his boots, Evelyn spoke her decision aloud. "I'm filing for guardianship," she said, voice steady. "They cannot go back to that shed. They belong in a home." Tom's scarred face softened. He had been a man of few words since returning from war, but he found them now. "Then I'll stand beside you. I'll swear before anyone that you've cared for them better than anyone else could. You saved them from the storm, Evelyn. Let me help." Shadow, as though understanding, rose and patted over to Tom, resting his muzzle against the veteran's hand. Tom's eyes glistened, his voice catching. "He knows, too. He trusts you, Evelyn." Word of Evelyn's plans spread, carried by neighbors who had once turned their eyes away. This time they did not stay silent. Mrs. Martha Ellison, her apron dusted with flour, spoke with unusual sharpness to the morning crowd at her bakery. "We owe those children a debt. That dog saved us, and if the girl saved him, then we're all bound together in it. Maplewood doesn't turn its back on its own. Not anymore." Coins began to clink into a small jar on the bakery counter. At first, a few nickels, then folded bills. Soon, the jar was replaced by a wooden box painted with the words for Laya, Wren, and Shadow. Farmers dropped in spare change after selling eggs. Seamstresses tucked in crumpled dollar bills. Even the stern postmasters slid in an envelope with no name. A group of local teenagers, usually seen loitering near the diner with restless energy, showed up one morning at Evelyn's doorstep. Their leader, a lanky boy named Owen Carter with unruly blonde hair and a nervous smile, held out a bundle of scarves and coats. "We were figured they could use these," he muttered. His friends shuffled awkwardly behind him, hands stuffed into pockets, but their eyes were earnest. Laya accepted the coats with wide eyes, her throat tight. Wren beamed, tugging a red woolen scarf around her neck, laughing when Shadow nosed it curiously. For once, kindness did not feel like charity. It felt like belonging. Even those who had once scoffed began to change in their quiet ways. The man who had sneered at the fair, muttering about foolish children wasting money on a mutt, now left a basket of apples on Evelyn's porch. No note attached. The plump woman who had clucked her tongue at their choice left 2 pairs of boots outside the bakery, their sizes just right for small feet. No apologies were spoken, but the gestures carried their own weight. Maplewood, once known for keeping to itself, was stirring. Something about the dog's fierce loyalty, the girl's resilience, and Evelyn's unwavering kindness had broken through its shell. One evening, Evelyn gathered the girls and Tom by the fire. Snow still pressed against the windows, but inside, warmth hummed. She knelt so she could meet Isla's eyes directly. "I've spoken to the county office," she said gently. "It won't be simple, but I want to be your guardian legally. It means you'll stay with me in this house, and no one can take you away without a fight. Do you understand?" Laya's breath caught. She had learned not to trust promises easily, but Evelyn's eyes held no wavering, only truth. Slowly, she nodded. Beside her, Wren clapped her hands softly, joy lighting her tired face. "We'd have a home?" "Yes, darling," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "A real one." Tom, sitting in his usual chair, leaned forward. "And if they need proof, I'll give it. I'll tell them what I've seen, how you've given them safety. They can't deny what's in front of them." Shadow, lying at the girl's feet, let out a low, contented sigh. His amber eyes reflected the firelight, steady as ever. To them, he was no longer just a stray or even just a soldier. He was their emblem of survival, of loyalty, of the bond that had drawn a town back to compassion. As days passed, the story of the rescue during the storm and the gas leak became part of Maplewood's fabric. People spoke of it not with passing curiosity, but with pride, as though Shadow's bark had woken something in them all. The girls were still fragile, still healing, but they were no longer alone. And in the quiet corners of the town, Evelyn, Tom, Martha, and even the teenagers who had once been careless now found themselves bound together in a new sense of community. The winter had been harsh, but from it had risen a promise stronger than the cold that Maplewood could change. Spring crept into Maplewood slowly, as if reluctant to chase away the shadows of winter. The snow melted into silver streams along the gutters, buds unfurled on the maple branches, and the air carried the faint perfume of earth, waking from its long sleep. For the first time in years, the town felt alive in a different way, less guarded, more hopeful. And at the heart of that change stood Evelyn Harper's little household. 2 girls who had once been invisible, and the old shepherd who had refused to give up. The morning light spilled across Evelyn's parlor as Wren adjusted the straps of her new crutch. It gleamed in the sunlight, sleek aluminum with rubber tips and padded underarm rests. The community had pulled together enough money not just for food or quilts, but for something more enduring. Freedom. Wren grinned, leaning into it as she took careful steps across the rug. "It doesn't squeak like the old ones at the fair," she giggled, her small frame steadier than ever. La clapped her hands, pride shining in her brown eyes. "You're faster than me now," Leia teased, though relief softened her voice. Evelyn, standing nearby in her pressed spring dress of pale green, watched them with a warmth she had thought her heart no longer capable of. The official papers granting her guardianship lay on the mantelpiece, neatly signed and sealed. The girls were hers, not by blood, but by choice and by vow. After years of solitude, her home finally echoed with laughter again, and always at the edge of the scene lay Shadow. His muzzle had grayed further. His limp grown more pronounced, but his amber eyes glowed with contentment. He watched the girls as if nothing else in the world mattered, his tail brushing softly against the floor. The spring festival arrived in late March, filling Maplewood's main street with color. Paper lanterns swayed from poles, stalls brimmed with pies and flowers, and fiddlers played bright tunes that carried on the wind. For the first time, Leia and Wren walked the festival, not as shadows on the edge, but as part of the crowd. Wren moved carefully on her new crutch, Leia holding her free hand, and Evelyn walked tall beside them. Shadow trotted at their pace, his ears pry-cricked, his head held high. People parted to let them through, not out of disdain, but respect. Children pointed, whispering, "That's the dog who saved the Thompsons." Shopkeepers waved, slipping extra candies into the girls' hands. Even those who had once turned away now nodded in greeting, some with shy smiles, others with murmured apologies, disguised as kindness. At the bakery stall, Martha Ellison wiped flour from her cheek and leaned across the counter. "I've saved the first batch for you 3, she said, handing over warm rolls. "And for you, hero," shedded, dropping a piece of ham into Shadow's waiting mouth. The dog chewed slowly, eyes half closing with quiet satisfaction. Tom Granger was there, too, standing straighter than he had in years, his field jacket exchanged for a clean button-down shirt. He shook hands with other veterans at the booth of the local association, his scarred face softening with every laugh. He shared. For so long he had lived like a ghost at the town's edges. Now, spurred by Shadow's resilience and the children's courage, he had stepped back into the light. "Good to see you here, Tom," one of the older men said, clapping him on the back. Tom nodded, glancing across the square where Leia and Wren skipped between stalls. "Feels good to belong again," he admitted quietly, his eyes flicked to Shadow. "That dog, he brought us all back." As the afternoon waned, the festival spilled into the meadow hill just beyond town, where families gathered on blankets to watch the sun set. Evelyn spread a quilt on the grass, and the girls flopped down beside her, their faces flushed with joy. Shadow settled close, his body heavy, but his gaze still watchful. The sun dipped low, painting Maplewood in strokes of golden rose. Chimneys smoked faintly against the bright sky, and laughter drifted on the wind. Evelyn's hand rested on Isla's shoulder, the other gently brushing Wren's hair. "Do you know what this feels like?" Wren whispered, her voice soft as the breeze. "What?" Leia asked, leaning closer. "A real home?" Wren said simply, her smile wide. Shadow shifted, pressing his head into their laps as if sealing the truth of her words. Evelyn's eyes misted, though her lips curved into a steady smile. After years of emptiness, she had a family again. From a short distance, Tom stood with the veterans watching. He lifted a hand in quiet salute, not just to Shadow, but to the fragile, fierce bond that had saved them all. And so they stood on the hill. Evelyn, the twins, and their old guardian, gazing at Maplewood bathed in sunlight. The town that had once turned its back now shone with new promise. In their laughter, in Shadow's steady eyes, in the warmth of the spring air lay the promise of rebirth. For Maplewood, and for them, it was a beginning. At the end of the story, there is a truth that shines brighter than the hardships faced by Laya, Wren, and Shadow. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive in flashes of light or thunderous signs. They come quietly in the form of a tired child who still carries hope, in the loyalty of an old dog with scars, in the kindness of a widow who dares to love again. These moments remind us that in our daily lives, we may pass by someone or something that needs us just as much as we need them. Do not ignore those quiet calls for help. They may be the very miracle God has placed in your path. If this story touched your heart, share it with others so they too may feel hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you and protect you.